Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. My name is Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Today is Wednesday, August 17th, 2022. Thank you for your patience as our live stream got started there. Not sure why it took a little bit longer than normal. I am very excited to continue our Summer of Broadband series, and we will be speaking today with the broadband officer from the state of Tennessee. We have thus far done Summer of Broadband sessions with state officers from Utah, from Tennessee, from Indiana, from Ohio. We'll be doing Tennessee shortly, as I just mentioned, and we will also be hearing from next week, Illinois. Very excited because as I was chatting with our guest just before we went live, I was once the state broadband officer for Illinois in the 1.0 days of the Recovery Act and the time in which the first major series of federal funds went to states, and state broadband officers were kind of in the driver's seat. That was 12 years ago, 13 years ago. We are in a very different era now. The program is differently structured. There is much more money, and there are different ways that different responsibilities, I should say, that states have. And we'll be talking about that shortly with our guest. But before we turn to that, I want to remind everyone that, as I mentioned, next week at Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, we'll be talking with officials from the state of Illinois. I'm excited to announce that we're going to have a special program on the Affordable Connectivity Program the following week, August 31st, and we will be talking about broadband mapping and data very soon thereafter. Really looking forward to a great series of upcoming programs. Fall is in the air. You can feel it. You know, the days are getting a little shorter and a little bit cooler. Certainly here in Washington, D.C., it's definitely gotten cooler, and I'm certainly grateful for that. Lastly, before we turn to our guest, I want to give a shout out to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do these programs every single week without them. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, Ookla, Bitstream Communications Inc., Michael Baker International, Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Powerhouse Management, Positron Access, Samsung, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to each of our sponsors for your participation. Well, with that a little bit longer than I had hoped intro, let's now turn to our guest for today, and got to make sure I'm kind of unpinning myself and making sure everyone's able to see our guests. We are very excited to welcome Taylor Beatty of the Tennessee Broadband Office. Taylor is really exceptionally well prepared for this role. She started as the state broadband director, and it's within the Tennessee Economic and Community Development Department in September of 2021. So 11 months going on, well, maybe more than 11 months, going on a year, Taylor. And prior to joining the Tennessee Economic and Community Development Department, she worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development Division, the one that deals with rural utility service. And so at USDA, she worked with then Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue and his broadband priorities, which at the time included the American Broadband Initiative, the Precision Ag Tech Force, and critical broadband infrastructure projects during the COVID-19 pandemic as it got started. She's originally from East Tennessee and has a master's in agricultural economics from Texas A&M. Welcome, Taylor. Thank you so much for being with us today for this Summer Broadband event.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, Taylor, I mentioned your position at USDA and the Rural Utility Service. As a first question, tell us just a little bit about how that experience with the federal perspective on agricultural issues and broadband in agriculture impacts the way you look at broadband in Tennessee.
Yeah, so I think most definitely impacts that. I think I've been in the last several months, as we've kind of shifted everything in the states to focusing on federal funding that's state administered. I think having a background and understanding a lot of those federal funding streams has really helped me as I've focused on our state and where we can, best be good stewards of that funding and deploy it as effectively as we can. But I also think just having a good understanding of our federal partners and the role that they play there, what resources are out there, because if we come to a situation where for whatever reason we can't help or we can't grant funding to an applicant or serve an application because there's so much demand right now, then we can definitely point them in the right direction to other resources that are out there. And so I definitely think my time in DC and with USDA was great, and just got a great perspective on what this issue looks like nationally. But it's been really great to come home to my home state and work on that here in Tennessee.
Well, Tennessee has been doing the broadband game for many, many years, not only kind of under the 1.0 discussion that I referred to earlier, but in the lead up to the pandemic, if you will, Tennessee reestablished. Or let me ask: Did the state reestablish its broadband program in 2017? One thing you definitely did in 2017 is you passed the Tennessee Broadband Accessibility Program in April of 2017. Tell us a little bit about that law,
Yeah.
Taylor, what it did and how it kind of structured the office.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, in 2017, our state legislature passed the Tennessee Broadband Accessibility Act, and that is what really we had done some work in the broadband space prior to that, but that was what really set our state strategy for broadband. And it did three main things. One, started a broadband infrastructure funding grant program. It did some different things on deregulation. It was the first time that electric co-ops were able to get into the broadband space in our state. And then also had a focus on education. So thinking through how we could partner with our libraries in our state in order to kind of hit some of those needs on digital literacy. So we were, I would say, even just a little bit ahead of the curve on the digital literacy side as well. So 2017 really was what jump started that. Our office was set up. We were housed in Tennessee Economic and Community Development, and had a broadband director and a grants manager from then on. And that first year, we had $10 million that was allocated for us at the state level, spent all of that money and thought, wow, I can't believe we spent $10 million on broadband. This was awesome. Came back the next year and the state legislature said, wow, y'all did a great job with that. How's $15 million? And the story continued, and the most we had on the state level was $20 million. And then, of course, COVID hit, not a surprise to anybody tuning in today. We got about $60 million in CARES Act funding, which was an outrageously large sum of money at the time in terms of, wow, how are we going to spend $60 million? And then, of course, as COVID continued and the emergency funding for broadband continued, we're sitting at a spot now where we're about to announce $450 million in funding for infrastructure through American Rescue Plan. So needless to say, our program has grown astronomically, and we are just so excited for what we've been able to do on the infrastructure side. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit too, but how we're planning for what we're going to do on digital literacy and how those intersect.
Well, you've set the stage nicely. I mean, I would put Tennessee in, a small group of states, handful, maybe a little more than a handful, that definitely kind of anticipated, maybe is the right word, the need for more investments the last part of the last decade, and depending on the state, put in greater or lesser amounts, but did start to put in state funds, of your own, and now we're kind of making that pivot, in some ways. And you tell me if you'd add to this thought, Taylor, that the transition from the pre-IIJA, before the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of November last year, and post IIJA is in some ways, switching from state funding to federal funding, or would you add anything more to the difference between kind of before that law and after?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, I don't know if ease in is the right word, because like I said, we went from a max of $20 million to now $450 million. But I think we've had the chance with ARPA funding at the state level to ease into administering federal funding at the state level. With emergency broadband bucket, a lot of those kind of federal requirements have been waived since it's emergency. And so we've had a little bit of time to learn at the state level what is and isn't required of these federal funding dollars, but things that will be required during IJA. So things like, environmental reviews and Davis-Bacon and things like that, that it's going to look a little different with IJA than it did with ARPA. And so, definitely that transition is something that all states are going through, or, if you haven't had a broadband office yet, they're jumping in there. So I think that transition is definitely something that all of our broadband offices are facing right now, for sure.
Speak another little bit or two about the ARPA process, right? I mean, and in some ways, ARPA is kind of an intermediate between the kind of the CARES Act and the almost like no regulations, like do with it what you want. I mean, spend it on broadband, right? But there's I mean, like what's the process for this 450 million that you've just talked about versus what you're anticipating the process will be like for IIJA's Bead program?
Yep. So in Tennessee, and I know it's a little different from state to state. In Tennessee, our $450 million was from $450 million was from American Rescue Plan, but it was from the state and local fiscal recovery fund bucket. And then there's also the capital projects fund bucket, which is also forthcoming from our state. So I would say definitely there's just the adjustments that we're working through in terms of, just different things that providers are going to have to report on, and just different things like that are going to be a little bit different than what we've had to do on the state level. But also with the understanding that ARPA money is more flexible than the IJA money. And so as we're thinking through the IJA money, we're thinking through, like, because states are required to create that 5-year plan for how we're going to deploy the funding. That kind of formal planning wasn't required with ARP in the same way. And so I think with that, just, some things like the timing, I think the key is moving from the emergency broadband bucket to kind of more general federal infrastructure spending money on broadband. I think also changes some of those layers on, like you mentioned, regulations and reporting and things like that. And so while we're preparing ourselves as an office for that, we're also working to prepare our providers and subrecipients out there, all of our stakeholders that'll be accessing that funds or applying for those funds, preparing them for what's coming down the pike, right, and how we can best provide resources along the way.
Well, I know that you met your deadline of Monday, Taylor, because the NTIA put out a press release this morning. I just put a link to an article we had on that on Broadband Breakfast. All states want BEAD funds, and all states and territories met their deadline of Monday to basically submit a pretty intensive series of documents. Talk just a little bit about what your last month has been like, Taylor, in terms of these. You had a July 18th letter of intent deadline and then an August 15th deadline to tell us a little bit about what you submitted on Monday.
Yeah, great question. So I'd say we're, definitely have been and are in the federal application planning mode, probably nationwide, but definitely here in Nashville, we've been really focused on that. And then also Capital Projects Fund application is coming up as well in September. So we're also working on that. I would say, the biggest thing with, what we submitted on Monday is, states were really tasked to come up with a plan for the plan, if they will. Like, how do we plan to use the planning funding to create our 5-year plan, which is a lot of the word plan, but all very important. And also, I think, shows the difference between the ARPA money and the Bead money through IJA. And so I think both that planning application and then the digital equity planning application, which was due a little while back over the summer. It's just a matter of us sitting down and talking through, what do we want our state to look like in the next, 3 to 5 years even. We're going to be coming up, and I mentioned this, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but, our 5-year plan, digital equity having to be incorporated into that. And so developing a digital equity plan that's going to coincide with a 5-year infrastructure plan, and how we want to make sure that we're accounting for every Tennessee household and business that currently lacks broadband. And so it's been a lot of big picture planning and trying to put pen to paper to figure out, how are we going to solve this issue here? What communities do we need to engage with that have not been engaged before on broadband? What providers do we need to engage with that haven't been engaged in our program before? How do we shift our outreach both to the digital equity and inclusion and literacy stakeholders, but also outreach to providers and communities that we haven't connected with in the past? And so I would say tons of planning, but really just a lot of that conversation around, how do we want our state to look, and how can we do what we need to do to get there?
And let's just go specifically back to, tell us
Sure.
just what you filed on Monday. What was it you had to submit? I mean, I know you've described it as the plan for the plan for the plan, right? Or the plan for the plan, at least.
Yes.
But tick off some of the things you had to put together here.
Yeah. So we had to put together a budget for how we plan to use the funding for the Bead planning application. States had up to $5 million for planning that we had to budget out, how we plan to use that $5 million. Along with that, we had to submit a budget narrative of basically the breakdown of every line item on that budget, and then also a project narrative for how we're actually going to do this, how we're actually going to get that budget accomplished in our plan. And then really those were the biggest things, just thinking about how you're going to use all that funding and what specifically you want to do with it to incorporate all of that into what you're going to do for your 5-year plan.
We have a question here from Daniel Smith. We want to encourage these questions. This is your opportunity. If you're on the Zoom channel, I think I can still get you on the others too. But let's that's where most of our questions come in. Daniel Smith writes, "What was done with the ARPA grants?" And this, you're talking about the 450 million.
Mm-hmm.
What do you plan to do with those? Right, you haven't spent them yet.
Yes. So the $450 million was all broadband last mile infrastructure grants. So all capital project grants. We went through that application process, started in January of this year. I'll also note this before I talk about our timeline, that our our projects in Tennessee, or our grantees, are the internet service providers. So I know some states do it different, where it's the community or the locality. For us, our grantees are the internet service providers. So we went through that process this spring and summer. Applications were due in March, and we just got through all the scoring and service area validations and all that fun stuff. And we anticipate making the announcement at the last week of August, first week of September. And we anticipate that to be about 74 to 76 projects across multiple different providers and in lots of different counties in our state, and then reaching about 140,000 households in Tennessee. So really impactful. And to put this in perspective, that of course is all federal funding. In the past, our state has invested about $120 million in our state, and then also the CARES Act funding, $120 million of infrastructure funding. And we've been able to reach about 140,000 Tennessee households. And so it's really amazing how much funding we've had and been able to invest, and how comparable it is to just what we've been able to do in the last several years, just through this one round. So really excited about that.
So you've already made the decisions, right?
We just haven't publicly announced it yet. So we're working through some final public notice response stuff over the next couple of weeks, and then
you'll release them late this month.
Them. Yeah.
And so it's 74 to 76 projects for 450 million. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do they range from? What's the biggest and the smallest?
Yeah, so I would say the smallest is a little less than $1 million. So let me also say this: our grant program this time around was a 70-30 grant match rate.
Okay.
That's important to know. The smallest was, a small area, less than $1 million. The largest is in the 20 millions. So pretty large projects in the past. We have had a $2 million funding cap for our grant program. And so this year we said, hey, we want providers to go big. We're going to remove that. And it's really awesome to see that we have some providers who, have had the chance to, finish close to their entire territory, close to their entire county. Just really good, awesome things that we're doing.
Okay, we have a new question from Scott Clary. 430 million to reach an additional 130,000 homes. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
All right. And
450 million in the number of homes might change in the coming weeks when we make our announcement, because we're still reconciling some of those numbers. Right.
Whenever I get numbers like this, I do quick division here. So that's $4,361 per household, right? These are areas that were unserved, underserved. What's the kind of the measure you used for those?
Yep. Great question. So all areas that are unserved, or what we would consider unserved, in the past, we have focused on areas being unserved at 25.3. This year, we were able to bump that up to lacking 120, or 100 over 20, with priority for areas that lack 25.3 or 10.1. And so we prioritized that in the scoring based on the percentage of locations that were lacking that. So all of these areas lack 120.
Wow. Okay. Great to get that, and great to see an actual concrete example of kind of you're moving up the unserved to underserved pathway, right? Okay. So now what's going to be different as we move from ARPA to the Bead program, and you've discussed, obviously you've submitted the plan for the plan. I haven't seen it yet. I don't know if it's been released or will be released. Taylor, can you give any insight onto that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know exactly how that is going to work on the federal level, or what we can or can't release at this time. I do know they are going through kind of a state curing process. So if there are things that states can adjust or things like that on the back end, I know states are working through that, including us at this time. So it's not in final form, if you will. So we're working still on that, but a big picture for the funding, or for the Bead planning funding, is that the majority of us states, including us, were looking at how we can use that $5 million in planning funding to be able to come up with that 5-year broadband plan.
Let's dive into some of the other aspects on adoption, use, digital equity. Tell us a little bit about how you need, how IIJA treats this, which is obviously very central, very integral part. How did you kind of address this in your, proposal you put forth 2 days ago?
Yeah. So I think for us, it's really interesting because we have focused so much on infrastructure, which is a very, very, very important piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece of the puzzle in terms of broadband. And so that's one of the things that we, are learning about how we get engaged in the digital equity and literacy side of this conversation. We have had at the state level a partnership since 2017 with our state libraries and archives, and they do this digital literacy programming with libraries across the state. But we've also been looking towards how we expand that. And then also in the, Bead NOFO, there was a lot of information on really these groups that we should be interacting with, like veterans groups and minority groups and, low-income households and folks that we have not specifically worked with in the past. And so, we are kind of in the learning process of how to develop relationships with those stakeholders. And so that was a lot of what we kind of put into our application, is what our thoughts are and how we engage those folks, how we think about, our partnerships with both these groups in rural communities, but also in urban. We've had a chance, or we will have the chance this time, to engage urban communities in ways that we haven't before, where there is still a large kind of digital equity and adoption and digital literacy need and connectivity need, even on affordability and things like that, in areas like, Nashville and Memphis and parts of Chattanooga and Knoxville. And so we want to be able to interact with them and form partnerships with them as well. And so I think it's been us working really, strategically on how we engage those groups in rural communities, but then also thinking through how we want to partner with our urban communities as well.
Okay. And definitely welcome coming back to this discussion, this question, and for our audience, again, feel free to lob questions to Taylor and myself here on this discussion. I mentioned a little bit earlier that I was in Nashville for the Fiber Broadband Association conference. I saw you there. You spoke a couple times at the Fiber Broadband Association conference. There's really a widespread sense, perception, it's documented too, that NTIA has basically put its thumb on the scale and saying, we want fiber where possible. Now, it isn't authoritative, it isn't, definitive, and Andy Burke, obviously the former mayor of Chattanooga, who's now I think he's the special representative for broadband, is this amazing title at NTIA. Andy, in his talk at Fiber Broadband Association, Fiber Connect, said, yes, even though we do have a preference for fiber, states can prioritize other technologies in their plans. Talk a little bit about the technology to be used, Taylor, and what you come at, how you come at it. What's Tennessee's plan going to look like, or does look like, once approved by the NTIA?
Yeah, great question. So Tennessee, we've always been really proud of the fact that we have maintained provider type and technology type neutrality. I mean, we have tried really hard to work with folks from kind of all camps in terms of provider type, stakeholder type, and technology, and would not have accomplished what we have at the state level and served as many folks as we have had we not, worked with all types of providers and their technologies. And so I think, within the guidelines of, the Bead funding, we plan to be as technology neutral as we can within those guidelines. And I know that's a little challenging. I think their specific speed requirements and things about symmetrical speed sometimes do weed out some technologies. But we want to continue to maintain the fact that, we welcome, all technology types and provider types to apply for our programs. And, even if it is something like, I think also another point to make here is, if a provider type can't or feels as though they can't reach the speed threshold or whatever it might be of the infrastructure guidelines that NTIA is requiring, I think there's also some conversations about how they play a role in the adoption programs and the interim solutions and working with communities and libraries and hotspots and things like that both serve a need and also an interim solution while we're working on some of these other projects.
Interesting point. I mean, this is a discussion that we at Broadband Breakfast have had many times. In fact, at the Wireless Internet Service Providers conference, we hosted a panel on should WISPs overbuild themselves with fiber, right? And so, many WISPs are going all in on fibers. Some are not, right? Some are saying no, wireless is sufficient. With this new dynamic of the 100 by 20 and the kind of latency, emphasis on latency, I think it's kind of pushing more people toward fiber. But that doesn't mean wireless is not a very good solution, if not for the short term, possibly in some areas for the whole long term. Any other thoughts on that point, Taylor?
No, I think that, that covered it. I really do think, like I said, this conversation about serving everyone is going to take engaging all different types of providers because, as you mentioned, like different communities or different specific needs often need different solutions. And so I think there's definitely places that we can engage all types of providers in this process.
I want to move to two big hot button, perhaps controversial issues. Obviously, again, to our audience, we welcome your questions here during this Broadband Breakfast Live online event. The two areas I want to touch on are municipalities and their role with broadband projects. And I also want to talk about mapping, okay, and the role of mapping historically and now. And there's a lot of big discussions on this very topic right now. Let's start with the municipalities. Obviously, Tennessee is one of those states that has a restriction on municipalities. This was a bit of a to-do 8 years ago when there was a whole FCC, and Chattanooga was one of the communities that was asking, and the FCC ruled in the city's favor, but then it got overturned by an appeals court. And again, you referenced this at the start, Taylor, how in 2017 the Tennessee law opened up co-ops, right, being able to provide broadband. It didn't quite go that far with municipalities. And the NTIA has made it very clear that for the purpose of BEAD funding, states are not going to be able to say no to cities' applications. Could you just talk a little bit about this? What is the public policy of Tennessee on this question? How are you wrestling with it as cities consider their applications under the BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll also say I was thinking back to Fiber Connect. I sat on the panel about municipalities, the last panel at Fiber Connect, and had some interesting conversation with some municipal providers and then from all over. And so it really interesting conversation around municipalities. I think here in Tennessee, and you mentioned there's some territory restrictions. And yes, that's still the case. I think in some ways, so this comes up every year just about in our legislature, both for municipalities and for electric co-ops, about expansion outside of those territories and agreements and things like that. And so, historically, our office has been neutral on a lot of those conversations because, we've again maintained a lot of the provider type neutrality. I think it's interesting here, in our state that, lots of folks in the public policy field have lots of different thoughts on municipalities and whether or not they should be providing broadband and or expanding or some of those things. And I think here in Tennessee, we've had some municipalities that have really stepped up and it's been since the start of our program in 2017 and have really done just such a great job in their communities, building out and engaging with customers. We have some new entrants that we anticipate being finalists that were finalists this year, but we anticipate moving forward with awards that have really stepped up and said, hey, we have watched our community be unserved for years, and we have what it takes to serve, and we want to apply to serve them. And that has been so encouraging to us as we've looked at the map of what's unserved in Tennessee and thought, how are we going to get someone to come to the table? And the municipality has really stepped up. And so I think you mentioned EPB and Chattanooga.
Yep.
Is kind of our golden example of a model that's worked. And so I think definitely in areas where that is the best option, I think they've really done a really good job here in our state.
We have a question here from Mike Dunn, and he's kind of addressing this tech neutrality statement, and he's highlighting Federal Communications Commission Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel's recent proposal to change the standard of broadband from 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits up to 100 down, I believe 20 up, but with a kind of a more aspirational goal of a gigabit down and 500 megabits up. And so the question here from Mike is, given all this, doesn't the importance of fiber increase? And if we don't spend this on fiber, are we going to need more funding in the future? What your reaction to that question? Taylor?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think, states are in a unique position right now. Such as this whole conversation just about how this is federal funding. And so a lot of times that conversation on what we can and can't do with this money supersedes state policy. And so I think it's no secret that, based on speed needs and community needs, oftentimes, we fund more fiber projects than anything else. We typically have more fiber applications than anything else. And so that does make sense. I think to your point about speed standards, fiber, if you're talking about a gig down, a gig up, or symmetrical speeds, fiber is what meets those speeds. And so I think to that end about, the increasing need for fiber, I definitely think that we support that. Fiber to the home is very important nationwide and here in our state. And so I think, I think the federal government is probably going to make a lot of decisions about that impact kind of how we are able to use this funding. But, with that said, we'll continue to allow folks to apply for many of those stakeholder groups, and to the end that their technologies are eligible to meet whatever needs, they're welcome to apply. But we'll continue to work as closely as we can within the
framework
requirements.
to still
Exactly.
allow non-fiber applications. We're getting some questions from LinkedIn. I'm very happy to see those. It shows it's working across multiple platforms. Scott Rudd asks, it sure is hard to understand why any state would want to limit interested investors seeking to bring broadband to unserved areas. I'm not 100% sure the question there, what Scott's getting at. Like, do you understand that limiting investors to bring broadband, Taylor?
I don't. I was wondering if that had to do with maybe the same kind of conversation about technology type. But yeah, I mean, I know it's hard to give a non-answer.
That's a fair point, because some people come in and they say, no, why would we restrict someone? Well, and the rebuttal or the answer is, well, if we're going to give the federal money to one provider, it should be to a higher capacity technology.
Yeah.
Let's move to the mapping question. Okay. Sure. Taylor, tell us a little bit about the history of mapping and we've got a link on the page for this event, which I provided in the Zoom link. And it's links to your department and as well as the Tennessee Broadband Accessibility Map. And if you go there, it says that it will be released in the fall of 2022. So tell us a little bit about the mapping.
Yes, great question. So we've been working, so let me, I guess, back up. So in the beginning of 2021, post initial kind of wave of the pandemic, our state decided or had the recommendation that we, or I guess kind of the research arm of our state, TASR, they came up with a recommendation that we should follow the lead of some other states and do a broadband accessibility map so that we know where broadband is and isn't. This, of course, came after the conversation that I'm sure you're hinting at that is a little bit on the controversial side, but is the FCC maps and reliability and things of that nature. So we started working on this in the summer of 2021. Our mapping vendors, Connected Nation. So Connected Nation reached out to providers and got, location data on where broadband is and isn't, or where they serve and don't serve. I think the difference between what we've done versus what the FCC maps have done in the past is that our vendors validated that information. There was public notice period. There was an opportunity for our consultants to go out into the field and see where the infrastructure is and isn't, and just validate that as much as we can. The challenge, of course, with maps is that you can post a map and 5 minutes later somebody else has been hooked up to internet. So it's never, I've tried to share, of course, with our state legislature and stakeholders in the community that there will always be updates that need to be made to maps. So that's something that it was open for public notice for about 2 months, where providers could challenge the data, but also communities could get involved and say, hey, look, this street, isn't there, or this new build is not there, and we want to make sure that that's captured. And so Connected Nation is working through those comments now, and we anticipate a new iteration to be out later this fall. And that is kind of the next copy of maps that we will use for eligibility moving forward, with the caveat that we always will allow that data to be challenged as things are moving and changing in our communities.
In our summer of broadband discussions with Utah in particular, mapping kind of came to the fore, and Rebecca Dilg, the state broadband officer, talked about how important it was that Utah kind of continued this mapping all from the prior program in 2010 to 2015 until now. And the other thing that I've written about on Broadband Breakfast, and we've also talked a lot about on broadband.money with our partners there, is there's a lot of discussion about states checking the federal map, right? So like 12 years ago in the prior version of this program, the states were partners and were collaborators with NTIA. And now it's almost like the states are, no, we're going to check these numbers and make sure that they're correctly check the map, so to speak. And there's actually a piece on Broadband Breakfast I'm going to share in the chat window of the Zoom conversation with everyone that talks specifically about this, about how states are aiming to use their maps to counterbalance and make sure that they get more funding. Do you have any concerns or thoughts in this regard, Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, I guess no specific concerns. I think you're right. Like the kind of the role of states is shifting a little bit in the mapping space. Chairwoman Rosenworcel has been meeting with state broadband leaders just to really, and I met with her a couple weeks ago, and just to encourage us to submit challenges to that fabric, so that to the fabric, and then also to the actual maps that are coming out soon, in the next couple of months. But anyway, all that to say, I think really the state's participation is going to be key, since we have all, I feel like, been a lot more engaged this time around than maybe in the past, in the sense that, like Tennessee, we didn't have a state broadband map the last time the FCC came out with maps. And so now we do have data that we can use to challenge some of those things. And so I think that role having shifted just a little bit from, yes, well, we're happy to work with the federal government to get what they need, versus now we're getting to kind of, add some accountability, but also making sure that we're adding some validation there to make sure that that information is correct. And I do think it's important, as you're right. I mean, we're kind of, states are on the edge of our seats to find out how much money or how much funding we might get from Bead. Our consultants have said in Tennessee that based on our unserved locations, we could get, $900 million to over $1 billion in funding. And so I know every state is kind of in that boat of, what's the range, and how do we, I think another challenge is, we're in the process of having to make the plan for the plan, as I've said, but we don't know yet how much funding we're getting. And so it's like, okay, we know we're going to get a minimum of 100 million, but we could get 900 million, and that is quite a range. And so I think preparing for that is something that states are doing, and how we should be involved relation to the maps and how that affects our funding is all kind of part of the plan that we're trying to get engaged in.
Yeah, we have another LinkedIn question. This is from Joseph Longway, and he asks, how do you see the Rural Utility Service, ILAC, or incumbent local exchange carrier providers, complaints of NTIA maps allowing CLECs, or competitive local exchange carriers, to come in with free money versus giving to them where it's locally used and consumed? So I think this question is going to the challenge process that you're anticipating, and that people are anticipating, of the NTIA maps, right? So, and you've talked just a little bit about this, but I mean, do you see kind of the maps, quote unquote, the FCC maps favoring one type of group or another?
I really don't know on that one. I think I would hope not. I would hope everyone kind of had an equal, shot there, in terms of, just making sure that the information is correct. I think that's really the hard thing about just mapping in general. And I do not envy the FCC at all, because all eyes are on them in terms of these maps, which I also, coming from the federal government also, I mean, everybody's eyes, I think, are on them in terms of the map. And so, I would hope that there's nothing like that that happens. But I mean, I think it's all going to depend on that level of accountability and validation that happens to really, check the facts, if you will, on just making sure that that information is accurate, because it's ever changing and we understand that, but we want to make sure it's as accurate as it can be before those funding allocations are made and before we go out to serve or deploy that funding.
When do you anticipate releasing the updated version of the map?
I anticipate probably maybe October-ish, somewhere around there. We're hoping to get it out as soon as we can. We're just working through we got a lot of public comments, which is great, because a lot of folks were engaged this time around. But yeah, we're working through those as we speak.
And Scott Rudd has come back with a specific question. Does Tennessee plan to challenge the FCC's new map or not?
Yeah, great question. So this is something that we're actually discussing now. I think we're going to look at what those public comments and everything for our state map come back as, and if it's something that we think, based on what we currently have, there are a bunch of discrepancies, we absolutely plan to move forward with the challenge.
Well, let's come back as our final topic again, unless there's more questions in the next few minutes. Speaking specifically about these programs to ensure not just availability, but also affordability, right? I mean, that's kind of a big component. A lot of people are talking about affordability in terms of digital equity. And you did mention the Tennessee, I guess it was the state library and the digital literacy programs there, but could you just maybe speak a little bit of that, and then we'll give you an opportunity to address anything else you'd like in these programs and getting higher capacity broadband out to people of Tennessee, Taylor.
Yeah. So, you mentioned the Tennessee State Libraries and Archives. We've had a partnership with them since 2018, 2017. We've worked with them to sub-grant out to libraries in our state, and they work on the technology and digital literacy training piece. That's something that we're kind of talking about how we want to ramp that up or expand that program. But I would say another piece of it, and I think they're very much looped into this conversation as well, is around the Affordable Connectivity Program. I think how we promote that in our state is going to be critical. I know EBB was something, or Emergency Broadband Benefit was something that did not have as much traction as we hoped in helping on affordability here in Tennessee. And so how we work with providers and community leaders and community anchor institutions to get that information out to the groups that it applies to, I think is going to be critical. Affordability is oftentimes, as like the biggest inhibitor to broadband accessibility. We have several communities in our state where we've invested and built out, and we're working to try to figure out what are some of the limitations to take rates. And oftentimes affordability is the biggest challenge. And so I think things like ACP, and then also ways that other organizations can step in and fill the gaps there, whatever that looks like specifically for that community or county, is going to be critical for us.
Yeah. Well, we did get one more question. We'll make this our last unless something comes in the next 30 seconds. Chris Gidry asks, is there a broadband workforce training component of the Bead program?
There sort of is, I think, to the extent that and I will say it this way, we most definitely plan to incorporate workforce development wherever we can, both in the terms that broadband is needed for workforce development, but also workforce development in the broadband space is needed in our state right now. And so I think There are definitely some components that tie into workforce development within Bead. But we absolutely plan to do that in our state, especially because, I'm housed in economic and community development, and everything I do has an economic lens. And so we know that workforce development is one of the largest tie-ins, if you will, to why broadband is important in our state.
Yeah. Well, just over the last few minutes, I sent along a link to this article about state maps in Broadband Breakfast. And then this discussion that you got into, Taylor, about the Affordable Connectivity Program prompted me to remind our audience that next week we'll be hearing from Illinois and the Illinois Broadband Office. But the week after, we're going to be talking about how to maximize minority participation in the Affordable Connectivity Program. So don't miss those next two programs in the next couple of weeks. Taylor, let's give you a chance to close us out. Any last words on, your goals and your visions? What does success look like for you and for Tennessee over the next 5 years, 10 years as the Bead program and other programs roll out?
Yeah, I think success to me looks like getting every Tennessee household and business connected to internet, and it is a very large goal with a state that has 7.5 million people. That is our goal, and that's what we want to do. And I think I am so encouraged by the outlook of, just even, having these conversations about, broadband breakfast. I've been working on broadband for about 6 or 7 years now. And when I first started, outside of providers and our select kind of broadband group of stakeholders nationwide, a lot of folks did not know what I was talking about. And so now everyone knows what we're talking about. And that is so great, because I think there's a level of just normal, education on what broadband is and isn't, and how we need to, continue turning the spotlight on this issue, and how we can work together across the digital literacy and equity and adoption kind of platforms and infrastructure, and piece that puzzle together. And I think states, my state especially, are positioned to chase after that success of getting everyone connected, and we're positioned in a way that we haven't been before. So we're really, really excited. I'm really excited. I love broadband, obviously, but I also love my state, and I want to make sure that folks are connected. And so, I'm just really excited about what's coming down the pike, and we want to do the best that we can with this funding.
Well, and this has been a wonderful hour. It's just flown by, literally. On behalf of Taylor Beatty, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care, everybody. See you next week.